I got involved with the Streator Historical Society. My first recollection was 1968. I was 10 years old. I was helping my brother, he was a paper boy, and we had to carry those Sesquicentennial newspapers all over our neighborhood. So after hauling them around all day, I spent the next few days reading those newspapers. And I learned so much about Streator's history and so much about Colonel Plumb that I immediately became a local history fanatic. I lived on Cedar Street, which was in the original town of Streator. That little triangle, Cedar, Water, Sherman Street, was the original settlement. And I just found that fascinating that I live right here. And all these stories are about what happened right in my neighborhood. And so that's how I got hooked. And I've always read all I could about Colonel Plumb. And I just found him a fascinating man. His character is what I want to convey most when I talk about Plumb. So today's talk is not going to be his biography. We are going to follow the timeline of his life, but it's not his biography. I want to tell you about his character and why he was so loved in his lifetime. Most people are not admired and idolized till after they die. But he was while he was still alive. And that's a rare thing. So we will start at the beginning. 1816, Plumb was born in Bustye, New York, which is in the far western regions of New York. It's in Chautauqua County, right south of Buffalo. It was back in the wilderness back then. Family moved around a lot. They eventually settled in Hartford, Ohio. Hartford, Ohio is in the far northeastern corner of Ohio. So it wasn't that far away from where he was born. It's way up north. It's near the Lake Erie, not far south of Lake Erie. But that's where he was born. In northern Ohio, throughout his life, which would have been the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, northern Ohio was full of abolitionists. It was the most anti-slavery portion in the entire country. And that's where he was born. And he grew up with those feelings, and he had those feelings his whole life. And I don't know if it was nature or nurture that made him so anti-slavery and so much of an abolitionist. Is it just in his nature? Because throughout his life, he always wanted to help the less fortunate. People that were the downtrodden, the misfortunate. And he always wanted to do what he could to help them out. And he always hated slavery. So I don't know if that was his nature and his character from birth, or if he developed that from living in northern Ohio. He grew up in Hartford, which was a very, very small village of just a couple hundred people. Only went to school through the 8th grade, like most people at the time. After he got out of school, at the age of 14, he got an apprenticeship to be a merchant's clerk at a dry goods store. It was run by a man named Hayes. And he was actually hired to grow vegetables and can the vegetables to be sold in the store. And then he did odd jobs besides being the gardener for the store. He was such a smart young man and such a hard-working young man. By the age of 20, he bought out half of the interest of the store. So he and Hayes became partners, and it became the Hayes and Plumb Mercantile Store. They soon realized, after he married Marilla Borden, and Marilla, there's a name most of you recognize. After they married, they realized there's not going to be enough money in this store to support 2 families. So Plumb talked him into opening a second store. And so he opened it up in Lenox, Ohio, the next town over, about 20, 30 miles away. So they opened up their second store. Plumb and Marilla moved to Lenox, and it was in Lenox that he got his first opportunity to prove he wasn't just all talk when it came to the anti-slavery movement. Get a drink here. The medication my doctor put me on gives me dry mouth. So. Or maybe I just talk too much. But anyway, in Lenox, Ohio, he lived above the store. The store was on Main Street, typical frontier town Main Street, wooden front stores. He lived upstairs in the apartment, which was common. And he had the habit every Wednesday evening of going to the Anti-Slavery Society meeting. It was held in the one-room schoolhouse, which is like the community center. And one particular Wednesday evening, he goes to the anti-slavery meeting after he closes up the shop. And this particular evening, as he's walking home, he realizes there's a small crowd milling around in front of his store. And as he's getting closer, he's thinking, what the heck's going on here? But as he gets closer, even though he knew everybody, it was a very small community, nobody would make eye contact with him. And he thought, this is strange, what's going on? He goes in, he unlocks the door, he goes upstairs to his apartment, and there's Marilla at the kitchen table with two of his friends. And he said, what's going on here? This is really strange. And one of the friends tells him, well, this afternoon, a stranger with a wagon came into town. He had a runaway slave hidden in the back of the wagon. He approached me and he asked, where can we hide this slave until nightfall we can get him up to Lake Erie and across the lake into Canada to safety? And he says, I know, I have a friend, Ralph Plumb, and he'll help us. So we brought the slave here. He's in your closet. Well, Plumb, the first thing he's going to do is he gets mad. He's like, why are you bringing this problem into my home? But he had just come from the anti-slavery meeting, and he was all full of fire and brimstone and wanting to help the poor slave. And so he got over his anger real quick, and being a quick thinking guy, he said, okay, so what's with the people downstairs, out in the street? And his friend explained to him, well, half of them are very pro-slavery. They're just trying to catch us helping a slave. And of course, that would be bad news, I mean, because it was national law, the Freedmen's Act and all. And the other half down there are anti-slavery people like us, abolitionists, and they're there in case we need help. So they're expecting like a little riot or a big fight or something. Plumb said there's not going to be any of that. He said, right now it's just a rumor that there's a slave up here, right? They said, yeah, nobody saw us bring him in. Fine, we're going to go about our evening like we always have. You two are going to go home. Marilla and I are going to have dinner. We're going to go about our evening. Eventually, when nothing out of the ordinary happens, they're going to get bored and they're going to drift off and go home one at a time. And as his friends were leaving, he grabs one by the elbow and he says, hey, before you go to bed tonight, though, make sure you tie up 2 horses behind your house. I'm going to need them for later on. So his friends said, no problem, and they leave. So Marilla and Ralph have their dinner. They sit out above the porch there, right on Main Street, like it was their habit of doing. He's smoking his pipe, and I don't know, she was knitting, crocheting. I don't know what women in 1839 did, but she was doing whatever that was. And they were talking about the day's events, just like they usually do. And Plumb was right. Eventually, everybody got bored, and everybody started going home. Well, they went to bed at the regular time, turned out all the lights, and he knew, even though all the people were gone, those pro-slavery people were watching. They were probably in the shadows somewhere watching his front and back door for them to leave. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, the darkest part of the night, he sneaks down into his store, he gets a couple of axe handles, he puts on a 6-shooter, something he rarely wore when he was in town, and he goes upstairs and he gets the slave, and instead of going out the front or back door, they crawled out one of the windows upstairs and they crawled on their bellies down the store tops, because flat roof stores at that time, people couldn't see them. They crawled on their hands and knees to the end of the block, and then they dropped down into the alley when they got to the end of the block. They made their way from the shadows to his friend's house. Sure enough, there were 2 horses. They walked the horses out of town, not to make any noise, and they eventually got on the horses and started riding north to Lake Erie. And it was open country there, so he could see he wasn't going to get ambushed, because you could see for 100 yards in either direction. But he knew at a certain point they had to cross a creek, somewhere between Lenox and Lake Erie. There was a creek they had to cross, and there was wooded area on both sides of the creek. And he knew that if he was going to get ambushed, that's where they would be laying in wait. And he was right. They got to the edge of the forested area, and they galloped as fast as they could to get through it. That was their plan. We're going to sprint through here and get to the other side as quickly as possible. Well, he was right. They were waiting. There were 6 or 7 men. And they were all on horses, and they rode out into the path in front of them. And of course, they were at a full gallop, so horse flesh hit horse flesh, and bam, men, horses, everything went flying in all directions. And then a big fight ensued. And it was 6 or 7 to 2. And you would think that the odds are against them, but Plumb said the odds weren't that much against us because it became quite evident real quick that all evening while they were sitting in the woods waiting for him, they'd been drinking whiskey. He said, so that kind of evened things out a bit. Ralph said he didn't have any trouble handling 2 of the guys himself. He said, and the runaway slave was taking on 4 or 5 all by himself. Of course, the slave was fighting for his life. If he had been captured, he'd been taken down back to Kentucky or wherever he was from, and he would have probably been whipped or killed, as an example of what happens to runaway slaves. So, I mean, this guy was fighting for his life. At a certain point, he broke free, jumped on his horse, and sprinted north on the road, which was the objective, to get this guy free and get him going north. Plumb was happy about that. He wasn't happy that he was left alone to fight all these other guys by himself. And even though some of them were pretty inebriated, there were 6 or 7 of them against one. It didn't take them long to get him down, and they were using his own axe handles to beat him. And he said it was evident right away that they were going to beat him to death. That they were not going to stop beating on him until he was dead. And that's how deep the feelings pro and anti-slavery were in 1839. And that's still, 20 years before the Civil War. But that's how deep the feelings already were. He did get his hand down, and he got his 6-shooter, and he pulled it out, and he started shooting. He doesn't know if he hit anybody, and he said he didn't care if he did or not. He knew he was fighting for his life. He started shooting until the gun quit, and all six bullets were shot. But by then it did the trick. As soon as the gun started going off, they scattered, jumped on their horses, and they were gone. They left him there alone. Eventually, he regained his composure, climbed up on his horse, and started riding north. He got just to the edge of Lake Erie, and the slave had been hiding behind a building somewhere, and saw him coming down the road and joined him. So he took the slave to a man he knew in Lake Erie, because Plumb got all his supplies for his store from the boats coming down Lake Erie. So he knew all the boatsmen. He knew all the boatsmen, and he knew who would help him and who wouldn't. So he got a guy that said, no problem, we're going to hide him in the boat for the rest of the night. First thing at daybreak, I'll get him across the lake into Canada. So, mission accomplished. So, Plumb rode by himself back to Lenox. He got back home just before dawn, badly beaten, badly bruised, very hurt. He had a broken arm, several broken ribs, and a broken collarbone. A lot of gashes on his head and forehead. Marilla had to stitch him up at home. They were afraid to go get a doctor to let him know he was taking a slave. He spent several days in bed, recuperating. And even though he was badly hurt, he was badly beaten, he said he never felt better in his life. Because that was the first time in his life he did something to help another human being. And it felt good. He said, and he realized no matter what sacrifice I make, any kind of personal sacrifice, financial or physical sacrifice, I can overcome that sacrifice if it means changing someone's life and helping them. So he made a vow right then to himself and to God that whenever he got the opportunity, he was going to help someone and that he could overcome whatever sacrifice that was. And it's a lesson we know that he kept the rest of his life, because there's a lot of examples, especially when he came to Streator later on, where he lived up to that. They stayed in Lenox a few years. They ended up having 3 kids, 3 daughters. When the daughters got to be middle school age, Plumb realized that's all the education they were going to get. Lenox only had a school up to 8th grade. He wanted his kids to have a better education than he had. And so he heard and knew about Oberlin, Ohio. It was a town on the other side of Cleveland, on the east side of Cleveland, still very far north Ohio, still very close to Lake Erie. But not only did Oberlin have a high school, but it also had a college, and this college admitted women, which was really rare in the 1840s and 1850s. So he moved his family to Oberlin, opened up another store. This would be the third Hayes and Plumb store. And I like to tell people he was into franchising long before the word was invented. So he opened up the third store. None of these stores were making any money, mind you. I mean, they were just barely enough to squeak out a living. But he was making a living being a merchant's clerk. And that's what he always considered himself throughout his whole life, even after he had opened banks and brickyards and became a mayor and a congressman. You asked him what he was, he'd tell you he was a merchant's clerk. That was his lifelong profession. So he moves to Oberlin, he opens up a store, and Oberlin wasn't that much bigger than Lenox. It was a small town, everybody knew each other. It didn't take long, though, in Oberlin for him to become one of the pillars of the community. He attended the city council, the village council meetings regularly. He got involved, he was a deacon at his church. So he was a mover and shaker and very involved in Oberlin. It didn't take long for the people of Oberlin, his family and friends, to talk him into running for the state Congress, for the General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio, to represent Northern Ohio. He resisted it, but they convinced him he needed to do that. So 1855, he was elected to the state legislature in Ohio. He served 2 terms, so he was there from 55 to 57 and 57 to 59. 3 things of real importance happened to Plumb when he was at the state legislature. The first was he realized that all these attorneys he was meeting down there doing business with were no smarter than he was, yet they were better educated. But they weren't any smarter, and they were making a lot more money. He decided he wanted to become an attorney. He started to study the law. Just like Abraham Lincoln did a generation before him down in New Salem, Illinois, he did the same thing in Oberlin, Ohio. He was waiting on people at his general store, and between customers, he was reading law books and taking different exams and practice exams. And it took him 3 years, the first 3 years that he was in the state legislature. He studied law that whole time. He ended up passing the bar exam. So 1857, he became an attorney. The second thing of significance that happened while he was in the state legislature is he met his lifelong friend, James Garfield. James Garfield was a mover and a shaker in Northern Ohio. He was from the Columbus area. He knew everybody. He was mostly a businessman, but he was also an attorney. He spent some time in the state senate at the legislature down in Columbus, Ohio. I don't know if it was at the same time that Plumb was a legislator or not, but they knew each other. They had met each other. They became friends. But at this point in their lives, they were just acquaintances. They knew each other. They got along well, but they didn't hang out, and they weren't really close. But that was very significant, meeting James Garfield, because it was a friendship that was going to last throughout their lifetime, well, throughout Garfield's lifetime. The third thing that happened was that Plumb was very significant in passing the Freeman's Act of Ohio. Now, the law of the land at the time, this is pre-Civil War, there was a Runaway Slave Act, and it was the Runaway Slave Act that convicted the Dred Scott and put him back into slavery. It was a terrible Supreme Court ruling. I think everybody knows that. But they used the Runaway Slave Act, and the Runaway Slave Act said that a slave was nothing more than property. Just like a shovel, a wagon, or a horse, that's your property no matter where you go in the United States, whichever state you go to, a free or slave state, that is still your property, and you can take it home with you. Well, what Plumb proposed was that Ohio become a free state in every sense of the word. All the northern states called themselves free states because they didn't have slavery. But Plumb's proposal, the Freeman Act of Ohio, that he got passed, stated that anybody who stepped on dry land in Ohio was a free person, regardless of the national law. And this is pre-Civil War, and pre-Civil War states' rights trumped federal law. And the whole idea of the United States of America was we were 34 separate countries. We were 34 separate states, 34 separate governments. The federal government was just a loosely knit, very weak government whose real only purpose was to make a common currency, to make trade agreements with other countries, so not all 34 states would have to make their own agreement. And so that was the environment at the time. So when he made that law, the Freeman's Act of Ohio, that once you stepped onto dry land coming across the Ohio River from Kentucky or Tennessee, you were a free man. And you had all the rights and you had all the protection of the government of the state of Ohio. Well, that kind of set off a firestorm. Nationwide, other states started passing the same law. And it got to be a common law. And of course, that was just one more brick in the wall that divided the North and the South. But those are the three most important things that happened while Plumb was in the state legislature. Now, the next time he got a chance to really prove himself as an abolitionist came in 1858. It was the same summer that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were going around here in Illinois. They had a runaway slave who was living in the open in Oberlin, Ohio. Oberlin was such a free area that runaway slaves didn't even have to hide. Once they got to Oberlin, they lived out in the open. And they were comfortable doing it. One guy, a young man named Jim Price, who was 16, 17 years old, nobody really knows. Price probably didn't know himself. He was a runaway slave from Lexington, Kentucky area. He showed up in Oberlin, and he just stayed. And the guy at the livery stable liked him, gave him a job at the livery stable, let him sleep in the barn with the horses, let him make a bed in there. And everybody in town liked Jim Price. He was just one of many slaves coming through, but he's the one that stayed forever. And they liked Jim, and they did what they could to help him. So if they were putting a new roof on their house or they were mending a fence, they'd go get Jim and pay him 15, 20 cents to help him, just so he could make a little extra money. He was kind of like the town pet, you might say. Well, the owner of Jim Price down in Lexington, plantation owner, he heard that Jim was living in the open up in Oberlin, Ohio. He didn't like it at all. He thought it was like snubbing his nose at him or something. So he sent one of his overseers to go up to Oberlin. He said, don't do anything. I just want to know if my slave is really living up there in the open like I'm hearing he is. I don't want you to cause any trouble. Just go find out and come back and report to me. So the guy did. He went up to Oberlin, looked around. He saw Jim Price. He talked to people, and they all said, yeah, he's a good guy. And so he went back down and reported to the slave owner. The owner wanted his slave back. And slaves were worth a lot of money. Big investment to them, especially when 16, 17 years old. So he hired a slave catcher, and he hired a retired sheriff, a lawman. And he said, I want you guys to do this legal. I want you to stop in Columbus, Ohio. I want you to get a warrant for his arrest. Here are his papers showing that I own this man. And you go and you get him and you bring him back here. So they get on the train and they're going. Now the train only went as far north as Wellington, Ohio. Wellington was 12 miles away from Oberlin. So the plan was we're going to go to Wellington, we're going to get a hotel room, we're going to rent a wagon, and we're going to go get Jim Price, bring him back, keep him in the hotel room till the next day when the train comes by, and then we're going to get on the train and go back south. Well, on the train up there, they realized, you know what? These abolitionists up in Northern, they're pretty radical. I don't think they're just going to let us walk in there with a piece of paper and walk out with this guy. We better kind of do this, you know, incognito. I think we need to have a plan to steal him. And get in there, grab him, get him out of town so there's no trouble. Well, that didn't work out. So they go to Wellington. They rent their hotel room in Wellington, and they rent two wagons. And their plan was, we're going to take these wagons, we're going to stop right outside of town in Oberlin, and we're going to hide one wagon. We're going to purposely break the wheel of one, and that's going to be our excuse to get Jim Price to come help us fix this wagon. So they do that. They break the wheel. They walk into town, half a mile or so, explain to the livery stable guy that, you know, we rented a wagon and we broke a wheel outside of town. Can we buy a wheel, and then maybe your guy can come help us put it on because we're not good at that kind of thing. And sure, Jim Price, yeah, you know, for you know, pay him a little bit, he'll go help you. So that's what they did. They did it. They get Jim Price there while he's working on the wagon. They hit him on the back of the head, throw a gunny sack over him, tie him up, and throw him in the good wagon because they rented two wagons, and they were going to run back. Well, a young kid. And I don't know how old he was. It's been a while since I read the book on this incident. But I picture him as maybe high school age or so. Young teenage kids saw this happen. They saw them throw Price into the wagon. He comes running into town screaming, "They've captured Jim Price. They've captured Jim Price." Everybody in the main street of Oberlin comes running out of the houses, come running out of the businesses. What's the commotion? What's the commotion? And he explains. Slave catchers have grabbed Jim Price, and he's on the road back to Wellington. Of course, they all know that's where the train is Wellington. I always say it must have looked like something out of a B movie, because everybody in Oberlin, Ohio, started jumping on their horses. You know, half a dozen men at a time jumping into wagons, and they're screeching down the dirt road path to Wellington to chase this wagon. With, of course, they probably had a 10-minute head start and a half-mile head start. It's only 12 miles, so they weren't going to catch them. But they're going as fast as they can, just a stream of horse riders and wagons and people and everything with pitchforks and torches, I'm imagining. But over 50 men took off after this wagon heading to Wellington. Well, the slave catchers get to Wellington. They pull up in front of the hotel. They grab Jim Price, who still has a gunny sack over him, who's all tied up. They drag him through the lobby of the hotel up to the room. He's probably kicking and screaming and yelling, so everybody in the place sees what's going on. Now, Wellington is in northern Ohio, too. They are just as radical abolitionists as Oberlin is, so they saw what was going on. And in a couple minutes, when all these people start streaming into town from Oberlin, screaming and yelling, where'd they go with it? Everybody knew what they were talking about, and they're pointing to that room right up there. Well, they're out there beating on the door, and the guys are saying, "Oh, we got guns, we'll shoot the first man coming through the door." So they evacuate the hotel. They surround it. By now, there's 500 people surrounding the hotel. And these people, they just wanted to quietly go in and grab him and get out. Now they got 500 people screaming at him. They're yelling back up there, either you release Jim Price now or we're setting fire to the hotel. The hotel owner's out there on his knees begging, "Please don't burn down my hotel." And eventually a group of about 8 or 10 guys run up the stairs and they kick in the door and they rush the room, and they didn't get shot at or anything. They grabbed Jim Price without any shots being fired. But they passed the hat around, and they raised an ungodly amount of money. I think $400 or $500, just what everybody did, which was, you know, in 1858, it's a lot of money. All the money everybody had in their pockets, they started giving to Jim Price, and they immediately threw him in a wagon. They headed to Lake Erie to get this guy to safety. And they did. Jim Price got to safety. He ended up getting to Canada. He bought about 500-600 acres of land. He became a very successful farmer in Canada. He made enough money that he eventually went back to Lexington, bought his freedom, and bought his family out of freedom. So again, mission accomplished. And the sheriff and the slave catcher, one of the two got tarred and feathered. I can't remember which one, but one of the two got tarred and feathered, and they were run out of town. The train came by the next day, and they were sent back to Lexington. That night, after this all happened, it was both Wellington and Oberlin were just dancing, laughing. They had bonfires, parties all night. I just going the 12-mile trip back to Oberlin. They were singing. I mean, it was just a big party. Everybody was slapping themselves on the back and congratulations. Eventually, what happened? We didn't bring the book, did we? There was a great book about this whole thing called "The Town That Started the Civil War" by Nat Brandt. We have it here at the library. We have a copy of the Historical Society. I was going to hold it up and show it to you. But anyway, eventually it got back to the slave catcher. These guys came back. The slave catcher got back, and the owner found out what happened, and he was furious. Now everybody in Oberlin and Wellington, they thought they got away with it, but they didn't. The slave owner, my owners and catchers, the slave owner ended up going to Columbus, Ohio, and getting the warrants for the arrest of every man and woman and child that was involved in the Oberlin to Wellington rescue, which is what the incident became known as. And there's all kinds of stories on the internet about that if you ever want to Google it. But anyway, he got the warrant for the arrest. They ended up arresting 37 men for that incident. And the 37 men would not fit in the Wellington jail. So they ended up being hauled to Columbus and getting put in the state prison. Unfortunately, Ralph Plumb missed all the excitement. That day, he was at Lake Erie needing a boatload of supplies for his store. Of course, he got back that afternoon, all the partying's going on. He joined in on all those festivities. But when it came time to make the arrest, he got arrested with the rest of them. He was such a staunch abolitionist, and he was so vocal at the Anti-Slavery Society meeting that everybody just figured he was there. And some people actually swore they saw him there. And Murillo was like, "Ralph, you know you weren't there. You can prove you weren't there. Why aren't you getting yourself out of jail?" And he said, "Because I have been such an abolitionist, and I've been so anti-slavery, and these people think I was there, that if I try to come up with a defense, they're going to think I'm lying to get out of it, and it'll ruin my reputation." So rather than ruin his reputation, he allowed himself to be arrested and thrown in jail. The men in jail became known as the rescuers. And of course, this made news all across the country. And the Buchanan administration, right before the Lincoln administration, the Buchanan administration was very, very pro-slavery. And Buchanan wanted these people prosecuted. And he wanted an example made of them of what happens when you try to help a runaway slave. Well, Plumb was, of the 37 that were arrested, Ralph Plumb was the only one that was an attorney. He had just gotten past the bar exam less than a year earlier, and he only did it to do wills and land titles and things like that. He had never stepped foot in a courtroom. But all the other rescuers looked at him and said, "We're relying on you to save our butts." And he's like, what do I do? So he's sitting in jail, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to do this. And while they're waiting for the first trial, the government decided they were going to put them on trial one at a time. In case they screwed up, they didn't want them all to get found not guilty. So they did them one at a time. So before the first trial, celebrities from all over the country were making their way to Columbus, Ohio, to visit the rescuers while they were in jail. And these are all, the anti-slavery people. Were coming, politicians, entertainers, everybody wanted to be seen as being anti-slavery and sympathetic to the rescuers. So they were getting a lot of visitors. One visitor that came several times was James Garfield. Garfield came, he visited with him. He was a big wig in that area, so he kind of felt like he needed to be seen as supportive of the rescuers. Eventually, Plumb got him aside and said, I don't know what to do. I've never been, I don't know how court works, I've never been in a trial. So Buchanan spent hours sitting in Ralph Plumb's cell with him, teaching him how trials work. This is what this means. This, if you object to something, this is what you can object to, what you can't object to. And that's when their lifelong friendship really got solidified, is when Plumb was in prison. And Garfield spent all these hours with Plumb. First guy comes up, and his trial comes up. Plumb represents him. It's just a one-day trial, and he was found guilty, got 5 years in prison. So something's not working right. So they got a week to tweak whatever they're doing. So Garfield's sitting in, Garfield was at trial every day, so he saw what was going on. So he sat with Plumb. Here's what we're going to do different this time, coming up with their strategy and what to do. The next guy comes up for trial, found guilty, 5 years in prison. And Plumb, he's just despondent at this point because he feels the weight of the world on his shoulders, responsible for trying to get these people off, and they're all going to prison. And he doesn't see any end to this before they go through all 37 of them. Finally, Garfield and Plumb were talking, and they said, well, what about that Ohio Freeman's Act? Wasn't Jim Price free once he stepped on the land in Ohio? Why can't we use that as our defense? And they're like, oh yeah. So what they did is Garfield went and he got a warrant for the arrest of the sheriff and of the slave catcher for kidnapping a free man in Ohio, and had those guys thrown in jail. And he presented those warrants for their arrest at the next trial because he wanted to do it in front of everybody. Well, that trial got stopped right away. Buchanan realized, okay, we're not going to win this fight because at that time state rights was a big issue, and the state says they're free. So they went into negotiations, and they said, we'll drop all our charges if you drop all your charges, and we'll go our separate ways. And that worked. They were all 37 rescuers, even the 2 that had already been found guilty, their convictions were thrown out and they all got set free. That negotiation with Garfield and Plumb and the representatives of the Buchanan administration is what undid the Fugitive Slave Act. And that's what overturned the Dred Scott decision. So our Colonel Plumb had a significant change in national policy. Just this guy who was nothing but a merchant's clerk. And he realized